warrants to be able to further our investigation, as you know, on all of these cases. I wouldn't be in a position to talk specifically about what the object of the search warrant was, but it's a critical piece.
This wasn't an immigration sweep. This was a cartel logistics hub hiding in plain sight, deep inside Chicago. At 3:41 a.m., the quiet of Chicago's pre-dawn hours shattered as columns of armored vehicles from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Drug Enforcement Administration, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Chicago Police Department slid silently into the neighborhoods of Little Village, Cicero, and Joliet. Headlamps cut through the early morning fog, casting sharp shadows across brick facades and shuttered storefronts. A faint crackle came over the radio, the signal to move. The order for a coordinated blitz carried through the enforced calm. Doors were smashed. White light flooded rooms that had never been visible to law enforcement. Agents poured in. The largest multi-agency sting in the U.S. Midwest in 2025 was underway. At first, the operation appeared routine, a coordinated sweep targeting undocumented immigrants. But within minutes, federal officers realized they were not just detaining individuals, they were breaching the nerve center of a multi-billion-dollar narcotics operation. What they had entered was not merely a migrant relay point. It was a hidden cartel logistics hub operating deep inside the United States. For years, federal agencies treated human smuggling and drug trafficking as parallel problems. Separate routes, separate structures, separate enforcement strategies. That night, those assumptions collapsed.
This case is another reminder about the dangers that radicalized Antifa-like groups pose to public safety and the rule of law.
Investigators discovered the network was using migrant flows as cover, moving large quantities of narcotics and weapons across state lines under the radar. Human vulnerability had been weaponized as camouflage. This was not border enforcement. This was urban warfare inside America's heartland. As dawn broke over Chicago, one question lingered above the smoke and sirens. How did a foreign cartel build an operational empire inside the United States without triggering alarms until now? Just hours before sunrise, federal agents swept simultaneously into three distinct zones: Little Village, Cicero, and Joliet. The operation unfolded with a level of coordination that revealed its true scale. Ground units advanced in tandem with reconnaissance helicopters. Unmanned aerial vehicles hovered overhead, their sensors cutting through the darkness. Doors were breached one after another. Suspects were subdued. In one location, the silence shattered as shots rang out, forcing SWAT teams to respond with tear gas and rubber bullets at what appeared to be an unremarkable brick townhouse. 2 stories high, nestled in a neighborhood built around morning coffee and school drop-offs. DEA agents quickly identified red flags. The walls were reinforced with steel plating. A dedicated surveillance camera network monitored the perimeter. A sharp chemical odor filled the stairwell. This was not a normal residence. The order was given. Breach. As the front door burst inward, agents discovered what looked less like a home and more like a military bunker. Rows of sealed sacks lined the floor. Each was printed in Spanish and stamped with Mexican shipping codes. The volume alone ruled out a simple stash house. This was a major narcotics transit hub, hidden behind the facade of everyday life. What appeared to be an ordinary home functioned as a central funnel in a cartel's U.S. logistics network. The operation was no longer about intercepting migrants or seizing isolated offenders. This was a direct strike into the heart of a transnational smuggling machine. The integration of people smuggling and narcotics trafficking under one roof blurred the lines between immigration enforcement and counter-drug operations, dangerously so. A quiet Chicago neighborhood concealed both human exploitation and industrial-scale criminal enterprise. Migrants in transit provided cover. Crates of methamphetamine, cocaine, and weapons moved undetected. Agents uncovered evidence that the network had embedded itself into the city's economic fabric. Businesses that appeared legitimate, a laundromat, a trucking depot, a small retail front, functioned as shell operations. Money moved through thinly filed ledgers. Cash was laundered through invoices. Physical goods flowed under the protection of legitimate commerce. What this townhouse exposed was not an anomaly, but a method. Instead of crossing borders and dispersing into remote areas, the network penetrated the interior, using urban anonymity as its shield. While frontline agents handled the kinetic side, investigators began tracing digital footprints. Financial trails stretched from Texas to Chicago, then outward to Mexico and Central America. They did it in real time, adjusting as new discoveries came in. The convergence of physical force and cyber intelligence marked a shift in how law enforcement confronted organized crime. None of this would have been visible under conventional assumptions. The cartel adapted, it blended in, and it operated from within. The fortress sat in plain sight, its true function hidden until force ripped away the camouflage. And if this stronghold in Brighton Park was only one branch of the network, then where did the rest of the encrypted routes lead? Agents began cataloging narcotics by the crate and firearms by the rack. The scale was measured in tonnage, not grams. In dozens of weapons, not a handful of guns. Chicago has seen cartel seizures of this magnitude before. Federal cases tied to Mexico-based trafficking organizations have documented multi-ton cocaine pipelines, large cash seizures, and weapons hauls across the region. Clear proof that major trafficking groups treat the city as a distribution hub, not a transit stop. At the statewide level, intelligence from the Drug Enforcement Administration has long warned that Mexican cartels, especially the Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, dominate Illinois' wholesale drug supply. They exploit the state's highway system, rail infrastructure, and air corridors to push narcotics deep into the Midwest. The paperwork recovered inside the warehouse explained how the disguise worked. Bills of lading referenced produce, auto parts, and cleaning supplies routed through shell vendors that resembled ordinary small businesses. This was not speculation. U.S. Department of Justice filings from recent Chicago prosecutions describe nearly identical warehouse nodes, linked to trucking firms and auto shops, used to mask heroin and cocaine shipments inside routine commercial traffic. Here, the pattern repeated in real time. On one workstation sat invoice templates, on another, shipping labels. A spreadsheet listed driver initials and waypoints, Naperville, Sugar Grove, then farther out into Missouri and Indiana, locations that read like errands until you remember how interstate distribution actually functions. What set this site apart was its digital spine. An operations room held 4 low-cost monitors connected to a single powerful tower. Inside it lived the memory of an enterprise. Encrypted chat clients with Spanish language menus, a folder of rotating encryption keys, a contact list tagged simply, Guadalajara. None of this required speculation about cartel capability. DEA assessments have repeatedly concluded that CJNG, in particular, combines violent discipline with sophisticated money laundering and transport networks, expanding beyond Mexico through franchise-style logistics embedded inside U.S. cities. Analysts have warned that cartel supply chains increasingly piggyback on legitimate carriers, then disappear into urban anonymity during last-mile delivery. This warehouse matched that warning almost perfectly. As evidence teams worked through the space, one discovery halted the room. Behind a rolling tool cabinet, agents found a small safe. The keypad was dust-coated, rarely touched. Inside were removable drives, and an unmarked USB stick labeled only with a date. When forensics mounted the device, the screen filled with structured diagrams. 7 color-coded corridors arced across the Midwest. Feeder depots linked into Chicago, then radiated outward to other states. The layout mirrored corridor models documented in earlier national cases. Bulk product moved toward inland hubs before fanning out again. The difference was critical. These routes were not reconstructed after the fact. They were drawn from inside the operation itself. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation had just exposed the cartel's physical logistics hub, the next question was unavoidable. What happens when that hidden war spills into the open for an entire city to see? As the dust settled over Brighton Park, the conflict moved from the streets to the screens. Inside a secure FBI facility, cyber forensics specialists powered up rows of confiscated laptops, phones, and encrypted hard drives seized during the raid. What they found was not disorder or improvisation, it was precision. Digital ledgers, transfer schedules, coded communication trails linking Chicago to Panama City and Guadalajara, not loosely, but like arteries in a single financial organism. Each device revealed a fragment of the same system. This was not just a drug operation, it was a financial infrastructure designed to survive anything except exposure. Working through terabytes of data, analysts mapped thousands of encrypted transactions concealed beneath layers of VPN routing, offshore intermediaries, and time-delayed transfers. Crypto wallets and wire payments moved millions in small, regulated pulses, deliberately sized to avoid triggering automatic reporting thresholds. According to federal briefings later cited by Reuters and CNN, more than $12 million in assets were frozen during Operation Midway Blitz. Investigators confirmed the funds were being funneled through Panamanian shell companies and Mexican clearing accounts used by cartel financial handlers. But as the trail expanded, something unexpected emerged. The network relied heavily on ordinary small businesses as laundering fronts. On paper, they appeared harmless. a laundromat, a body shop, a small trucking company. Inside, money was layered, recycled, and gradually reintroduced into the legitimate economy as clean capital. The strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. Each business generated just enough real revenue to make irregular deposits appear routine. The method mirrors techniques repeatedly flagged in U.S. Department of Justice reports on cartel financing. Drug profits collected locally, structured into deposits, and routed overseas behind layers of corporate documentation. As analysts followed the digital traces deeper, another layer surfaced. Several flagged transfers intersected with municipal vendors and political donor channels in Illinois. While investigators have not publicly named individuals, internal memos referenced by NBC News suggested potential bribery schemes involving licensing offices and inspection permits. Small payments, targeted advantages, just enough to keep shell companies operational and invisible. For the cyber agents dissecting the evidence, one conclusion became unavoidable. The battlefield had changed. Modern cartels no longer needed to cross borders with suitcases of cash. They didn't need armored convoys or bulk smuggling routes. They needed a smartphone, a spreadsheet, and an accountant who understood which bank codes to exploit. And by the time authorities saw the full picture, the system had already been running, quietly, inside the city. Transactions were split into hundreds of micropayments, each one carefully kept below federal reporting thresholds. Individually harmless, collectively invisible. From there, the money moved at digital speed, Chicago to Panama, Panama to Mexico, and then back into the United States disguised as corporate loans, consulting fees, and import costs. Agents traced one chain in particular. It began with a cash-based trucking business in Cicero. Every Friday, modest deposits were made at a suburban bank branch. Those funds were bundled into a trust managed in Kansas, routed to an investment firm in Mexico City, and finally surfaced in Panama City as a consulting dividend. The structure was elegant, deliberate, and almost legal. By the end of the second week, forensic teams had assembled the full picture. More than a dozen offshore companies tied to CJNG's logistics wing had been identified. Every one of them had passed money through American banks. The findings forced the U.S. Department of Justice to coordinate directly with the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to flag the transaction patterns for future detection. But the most unsettling discovery had nothing to do with software or accounting. It was about proximity. The same financial systems that processed ordinary paychecks and mortgage payments had for years moved the proceeds of cartel violence with mathematical indifference. The barrier between crime and commerce was no longer a wall. It was a paper-thin line written in digital ink. That was the haunting truth exposed by Operation Midway Blitz. When money travels faster than law, justice has to learn to chase in real time. Yet even as Chicago debated the cost of the operation, a larger question hovered over Washington. What if the cartel hadn't been defeated at all, only displaced? When the raids ended, Chicago did not fall silent. By the following evening, city streets filled with chants, placards, and camera lights. Hundreds gathered outside federal buildings demanding answers. Community activists claimed immigration agents had swept up innocent workers, splitting families in the chaos. The backlash spread rapidly across social media. Within hours, the phrase Operation Midway Blitz was trending nationwide. Inside federal command centers, officials viewed the same events very differently. To them, this was not an immigration controversy. It was a national security operation. Television networks replayed the footage on loop. Rows of sealed narcotics packages, racks of rifles, tables stacked with encrypted phones. Each image carried its own shock. According to a report by ABC News, more than 4.3 tons of methamphetamine and cocaine were recovered, enough to flood multiple U.S. states, with an estimated street value exceeding $600 million. And as the images circulated, one reality became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just Chicago's problem. Another segment from CNN highlighted a critical detail: 37 firearms and 2 grenade launchers recovered from the Brighton Park warehouse. The discovery blurred the line between drug trafficking and paramilitary planning. For viewers across the country, the question was no longer just how a cartel could hide this much inside an American city. It was how long it had been there. Behind the scenes, journalists and federal officials began revealing the scale of coordination that made the operation possible. Operation Midway Blitz was not a single-agency raid. It was a blueprint. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement tracked human movement and cargo flows. The Drug Enforcement Administration monitored drug routes and precursor shipments. The Federal Bureau of Investigation traced encrypted communications and financial transfers. And the Department of Homeland Security provided intelligence fusion across agencies. That multi-agency framework allowed arrests, asset freezes, and cyber seizures to be synchronized in real time. It marked one of the first domestic operations to treat organized crime not simply as a law enforcement issue, but as a national security threat. From a tactical standpoint, that distinction mattered. Traditional raids focus on targets, seize contraband, make arrests, and move on. Midway Blitz functioned differently. Each agency played a defined role within a single operational web. ICE used immigration data to block escape corridors. DEA units traced chemical supply chains upstream to source vendors. The FBI's cyber division followed digital money trails into encrypted accounts in Panama and Mexico. Law, finance, and technology moved together. That unity of effort became the operation's backbone. Federal analysts later told NBC News that the Midway model would likely shape future counter-cartel actions in cities such as Houston and Los Angeles, where criminal migration routes and money laundering networks increasingly overlap. For national security planners, the question was immediate. Do you scale this model nationwide, or contain it before the boundary between enforcement and surveillance blurs even further? In the weeks that followed, victory did not bring rest. It brought momentum. What began as a Chicago operation expanded rapidly into a tri-state pursuit, stretching across Indiana, Missouri, and Wisconsin. Federal agencies concluded that the Brighton Park warehouse was not an endpoint, but a single node inside a much larger network. The U.S. Department of Justice confirmed through official briefings that new search warrants and financial subpoenas had been issued across the Midwest, targeting companies and accounts linked to the cartel's logistics system. Surveillance methods evolved. Boots on the ground gave way to eyes in the sky. Radar-equipped vehicles and drone fleets operated by the Department of Homeland Security began tracking interstate trucking routes in real time. Highways once filled with routine freight traffic now carried an invisible layer of monitoring: license plate readers, infrared scanners, aerial reconnaissance, all feeding data into fusion centers in Illinois and Washington. A later CNN report described the effort as the largest coordinated monitoring of domestic transport routes since September 11th, though officials declined to confirm exact figures. Each scan revealed new connections. Trucks registered to small logistics firms in Joliet and Cicero reappeared under new ownership in Evansville, Indiana, then later near St. Louis, Missouri. Bank accounts tied to those firms showed familiar patterns: small deposits, rapid withdrawals, and recurring transfers through Panamanian intermediaries. The same system, the same signatures. The discoveries forced the FBI to formally declare Phase 2 of the investigation. What had started as a citywide raid had now become a regional manhunt. And with it came a final realization. Operation Midway Blitz did not end a cartel operation. It exposed a method, one that may already be operating elsewhere. According to a report by NBC News, several high-level suspects, including a financial coordinator known by the alias LRE, fled west towards St. Louis just days after the Chicago arrests. Within hours, the Federal Bureau of Investigation Fugitive Task Force began tracking communications between those figures and offshore servers believed to host encrypted ledgers tied to CJNG's North American operations. What agents uncovered fundamentally changed how they viewed the threat. CJNG was not operating like a gang, it was functioning like a corporation. As analysts synchronized data from newly monitored bank accounts, another alarming pattern emerged. Intelligence from the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network pointed to a new tactic. Shipments labeled as humanitarian aid were being prepared in Mexico, bound for U.S. destinations. Inside those containers, investigators suspected narcotics concealed among medical supplies and relief materials, leveraging humanitarian corridors to bypass scrutiny. The strategy was both elegant and deeply disturbing. This development, first reported by Associated Press, sent shockwaves through federal agencies and triggered a nationwide reassessment of customs inspection protocols. By midsummer, Operation Midway Blitz had evolved into a network-wide counteroffensive. More than 100 financial accounts were frozen. Dozens of trucks were impounded. Multiple shell companies were stripped of their operating licenses. Yet each success exposed a deeper truth. For every logistics node dismantled, another surfaced under a different name, sometimes 2 states away. The organization had built redundancy into its DNA. That resilience forced Washington to rethink its approach. Intelligence agencies began drafting a new interagency doctrine, one that treated transnational criminal organizations as hybrid threats, blending traditional law enforcement with national defense tools. What emerged from Chicago was no longer just a drug case. It was a blueprint for internal defense. A recognition that modern conflict no longer requires battlefields. It unfolds on interstate highways, inside financial ledgers, and through corporate paperwork that appears legitimate, until it isn't. And this is where the story turns unsettling. If CJNG could exploit humanitarian shipments and hide behind American corporate structures, what other systems might already be compromised? The next battleground may not be a border crossing or a coastal port. It could be a warehouse in the heart of the United States, where pallets of ordinary goods conceal a new form of warfare disguised as commerce. By the conclusion of Operation Midway Blitz, the numbers spoke clearly. More than 550 suspects were taken into custody, 4.3 tons of narcotics were seized, and over $12 million in cartel-linked assets were frozen, figures confirmed by federal briefings and independently verified by Reuters and CNN. But the statistics only hint at what the operation truly revealed. America's cartel war is no longer confined to border zones or remote jungles. It is unfolding inside its own cities. Chicago became the warning signal. The cartel did not just move drugs. It built financial systems, front companies, and digital pipelines that bled directly into legitimate infrastructure. In this new form of conflict, every warehouse, every logistics hub, every money transfer carries the potential to become a battleground. Homeland security is no longer a line on a map. It is the airspace above cities, the networks beneath them, and the balance sheets running through American banks. Operation Midway Blitz proved that the United States can still strike first, adapt quickly, and expose what hides in plain sight. If you want clear, fact-based breakdowns of what's really happening inside the U.S., subscribe, leave a like, and share your take in the comments.